So my name is Chris Wade. I'm the CTO with Itential, and Itential is an automation software company, and we focus on networking cloud infrastructure. So when we start thinking about how we're going to automate our diverse networks, the first thing we usually think about is kind of what are our guiding principles. We have a lot of demos today. We're going to be going through some CLI automation, some API automation, and when we're clicking through those UIs and the guys are going through it, I just want to give you a little bit of background on how we think about building our products and what we think about the market. So networks are getting more complex. I'm going to spend some time walking through why we think networks are getting more complex, and how we manage them is more important than ever. I think you've seen a bunch of network field day presentations on modern networking infrastructure, how we're moving to the cloud, how things are being driven by software. And we need to couple that with some automation techniques so we can take advantage of that. So we'll talk a bit about how networks are becoming more critical as we have more diverse networking infrastructure. So if we take that as granted, then the question is, how do we deal with this? So with all of this infrastructure, we have kind of a tool for every job. There's not going to be a single silver bullet for any of this. So we're going to talk about how do we use different tools for different parts of the domains? How do we tie them together? And with that, how do we have a diverse set of source of truth? So with each of these tools and with each of this modern infrastructure, the question is, how do we gain confidence and trust? How do we have the data available to us so we can drive automation? And ultimately, in the previous field day, we did infrastructure as code. We think that's where we're headed. We're going to talk a bit about data validation. We're going to talk about integration with lots of systems. And we're going to talk ultimately about how we can have kind of an API machine-first approach to automation. So if you take a step back and think about how CIOs think about networks, we've been very comfortable splitting the network and the cloud teams. So historically, we've been the networking team. We've had data centers. We've had branches. We've had local applications. And about 10 years ago, we started adopting the cloud. So the idea here is that we had a DevOps team that focused on AWS and some of the other cloud infrastructure. And we thought about, when we start to adopt applications in the cloud, they're different. You know, a VPC might be different than a VLAN. The level of complexity might be different. And we think that most enterprises were very comfortable splitting these two teams. So we basically had two different ways of working. We had two different sets of techniques. We adopted different tools and mindsets on how to support this. But as we start thinking about modern network ecosystem, we're going to start seeing this stuff blend together. So what was traditionally in a data center might be moving into the cloud. And I think more modern approaches are going to start to see this wall kind of come down. And we're going to talk about some of the different networking technologies that enable that. So if we kind of walk through the evolution of what we see as an enterprise network, you know, we're all aware of we had branches and we connected it over some MPLS circuits to a data center. And as we stated, over the last 10 years, we started to adopt cloud. So we might have started with one. Most people are using multiple clouds now. And then we start thinking about, I need to connect these things together. I'm going to put applications in different clouds to take advantage of those cloud-specific techniques and technologies. And as I start to adopt multiple clouds, we start thinking about connecting these clouds together. Even folks that don't think of like, I'm adopting a multi-cloud strategy, your email team might be using Office 365. You might be using Okta or AD as a service for some of your IAM platforms. And then there's been plenty of SD-WAN presentations throughout NFD. So the WAN team starts thinking, I want to modernize my WAN. I'm going to start connecting my branch offices over some overlays. And then we start saying, I got all these applications in the cloud. I'm starting to adopt this SD-WAN technology. I'm moving some of my traffic over IPsec over the internet. But maybe I need some cut-throughs. Maybe I need some on-ramps to the cloud. Maybe I'm adopting more SaaS platforms for my enterprise. And if I'm super advanced, I might be looking at some edge types of technologies of where I'm going to host my applications. And then maybe the firewall team comes along and says, we're not going to do any more perimeter-based firewalls because my stuff's kind of exploded all over the internet. I'm going to start doing kind of a zero trust model. So we talk about this as kind of your network exploded on the internet under the concept of really, nobody sat down and said, I want to draw a network diagram like this. But what happened was we had each business unit, we had each network segment owner say, I'm going to optimize, I'm going to use the latest technology for what I do. So the firewall team might have picked Zscaler, the WAN team might have taken SD-WAN. And ultimately, we end up with a fairly complex networking infrastructure where I have my users on one end and they're trying to connect to the diversity of applications on the other end. So from an Itential standpoint, when we start to observe this within the marketplace, we really think about, if I'm going to do network automation, what does that mean? For a long time, we've talked about vertically integrated devices. So when I start thinking about what are the network aspects that make up the drawing we were just looking at. So some of it's cloud consumed, some of it's virtualized, some of it's controller driven. I still have my vertically integrated devices. So when we look at all this diverse technology, we pretty much break it down into these 7 categories. So on the network side, we have everything from vertically integrated devices, which still dominate majority of networks today. But we're also seeing lots of white box. We're also seeing white box with a NOS controller. I think DriveNets was just before us. We're seeing software controlled solutions, more packaged solutions around SD-WAN, SD overlay. And then on the cloud side, we kind of take an inverse model where, we typically look at cloud as kind of IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS on the compute and application side, and we take a similar mindset as it pertains to networking. So in the cloud, we could have VPCs and VNets and transit gateways. Most of your service provider community is driving towards a network as a service concept. So we have Equinix ECXs, we have from SaaS vendors, we just talked about firewall as a service and some edge concepts. And ultimately, we look at this diversity of networking as a challenge for how do we operationalize this. The exciting part from our perspective is that there's more innovation in the networking space than we think we've ever seen. For a long time, it was about speeds and feeds. And to take advantage of these networks, we really have to think about how do we consume this technology? How do we provide a management plan, and how do we automate these concepts? So if we agree that our networks are changing, and we agree that a lot of the new technology is diverse, then we can start to think about how automation applies to this. And Itential being an automation software company, we think a lot about this. So even though things are different on the network and the cloud side, they boil down basically to kind of CLI concepts and API concepts. And when we originally thought about this, people are very accustomed to talking about, on the traditional networking side, we were CLI dominant for a long time. And we thought about this and we said, the new modern network ecosystem is coming with APIs. So we need to think about, when we manage networks and when we start to automate things, we have to think about how can we have both a CLI and API concept. On the cloud side, since this is started off a little bit more modern, we kind of start with UIs and we start with APIs. That's the default behavior. But what's interesting to us is, as we start to think about how do we automate these things, you see with AWS Shell, you see with Terraform and other technologies, that we're actually applying kind of CLI automation techniques on top of some of these APIs. So at the end of the day, when we start thinking about automating our network infrastructure that's highly diverse, we want to think about the ecosystems that have developed here. Because ultimately, automation starts with an individual talking about, I want to automate what I'm working on. I want to be better at what I'm doing. And we start to grow that into, how do I share that automation? How do I create team-based automation? And ultimately, how do I provide automation that traverses these multiple domains and starts to take into consideration the diversity of both the networking stuff and organizationally, how do we all work together to provide automation? So if we think about all of these tools and we think about the level of complexity that's involved, the exciting part for us is we think that this networking innovation cycle is really just getting started. When we had to develop chips, we had to develop 10 for everything, there was a certain life cycle to that adoption. Now that a lot of the new networking concepts are very software-based, we're seeing an accelerant on that network innovation. I think it flies through Network Field Day, and I think we need to be prepared for how does this innovation, how can we take advantage of this innovation? How can we support the digital transformation of our enterprises by taking on this technology and having a way to integrate it together? So if I take a step back and think about kind of how we've adopted these technologies and how this network has evolved, for a while, we thought there was a certain amount of complexity in the network. And I think the tools and our operational procedures kind of matched that. We were pretty risk adverse. We did things in the middle of the night. We wrote some scripts to automate certain capabilities. And as we said, when AWS and some of the cloud public cloud vendors came out, we started to think about moving things into the cloud. And there was a big debate around, VPCs versus VLANs. Are VPCs easier? It's somebody else's routing infrastructure. And I think amongst leadership, at least, we looked at kind of this AWS effect where people thought networking was going to get easier. We were dealing with these complex applications in the cloud. And a lot of times we call it the AWS effect, where there was a point in time, I believe, where people were thinking like, we'll just move it into the cloud and we'll shut off the data center and things will be quote unquote easier. The inverse has happened, in our opinion, is such that people are obviously moving to multiple clouds. We're adopting these networking technologies that we just walked through, SD-WAN, multi-cloud, distributed IT, and edge. We're starting to have our network be a network of networks distributed across the internet. And that complexity is not just where it was before. We think it's increasing as the technologies get adopted. And the driver is not that we want the network to be complicated. The idea is that we want to adopt applications and technologies to drive business. And the byproduct of that is we need a network fabric to make it all go. And the byproduct of this complexity is that when we look to our peer groups, how do we deal with complexity when we write software? How do we deal with complexity in other domains? We need to apply a certain level of automation. And we need to think about how do we have a machine-first approach to tying this stuff together so that we can actually take advantage of it, which is what we're going to spend a lot of our time on today. So if I think about how Itential builds our products to support this, we're going to concentrate on three main areas today. The first, Rich is going to talk about our automation gateway. And the automation gateway is our CLI automation platform. You'll see within, when he walks through the demo, the idea here is that there's been a lot of awesome automation happening within the industry. Very complex automations within things like Ansible and Python, and a lot of awesome automation within Terraform pointed at the cloud. And what we want to talk about is how do we take advantage? How do we go from an individual writing that automation, sharing it with the team, and then integrating it into a larger automation concept? So Rich is going to walk through Automation Gateway and do some demos to show how we do that. The second is within Automation Studio, which is our API automation platform. This really shows our bias towards APIs. The modern platforms, whether it be networking or cloud, are producing very robust APIs. The ability to move from a human-based CLI to a machine-based API can't be overstated. Basically, this has allowed us to write software that consumes APIs dynamically, so we can take advantage of APIs and take advantage of these features in a very rapid way. So when Alex goes through the demo within Automation Studio, we're going to onboard some new infrastructure. We're going to build some API first demonstrations, and we're going to build it from start to end to show kind of the power of having that API first mindset, and how do we tie both the gateway concepts with CLI automation into an end-to-end automation concept. So to wrap it up, the third demo, because I've talked a lot about automation, is that the third demo is really going to be focused, and the third section is really going to be focused on configuration and compliance. So if we think about how compliance complements automation, the mindset around automation is that we need to have solid data. We have to have an understanding of our network. We need to be confident. So back to the guiding principles, we need to have a certain level of trust and confidence to drive automation. And the one question is, how do we drive that trust and confidence? And for a long time, we've been doing NCCM types of activities where we build templates and run reports in the network to see who's been changing the network so we can go put it in place. But if we think to the diversity of networks, now we're dealing with CLI networks, we're dealing with API networks and everything in between. So the question is, how do I continue to support trust and confidence? How do we apply compliance concepts to the ecosystem to support automation? So we've had this operational mindset for a long time where we make changes to the network and then we see if we did anything wrong. And we've had that mindset really focused around risk mitigation. If we can have compliance apply to the diverse set of networks we're talking about, and we can actually predate the automation, we can start moving from kind of a compliance mindset to more of a validation mindset so that we can put guardrails in place to really drive organizations forward with automation.
Just for context, as we go into these demos, can you describe your target market, whether it's specific verticals, any specific client sizes that you're primarily engaged with?
Sure. So the way automation's really been adopted in the marketplace has really been focused on kind of the people that adopt these modern concepts. So if you think back to the adoption cycle for things like SD-WAN, things like data center overlay, those have really been initiators of people to revisit how they manage their networks. So, if we were talking last field day or 4 or 5 years ago, it'd be people that were adopting those modern concepts. We think those are broad-based at this point. So the typical customer that we engage with is broad-based enterprise. It doesn't really have anything to do with size of network or complexity. It's the desire to support kind of digital transformation. It's the desire to support new technologies that require a different way of thinking. Because we've had in CCM tools, we've had a lot of tooling, network management for a long time. And as we start to look at these new things, they're less applicable. I can't necessarily use those tools and just swivel chair to the new thing. So we're starting to see these little silos pop up, and maybe you can get by as you just get started. But as you start to think about adopting these networking concepts at scale, people are really revisiting how we manage those networks. And I think that kind of fits right into the storyline of our typical customer. So broad-based enterprise for sure.
Great, thank you.
Hey, Chris, just to kind of piggyback off of that, from a adoption perspective, are you seeing not only what you just described, but those enterprises or whatever they may be, where they already have talent that's doing some of this, using things like Terraform, Ansible, Nornir, things like that, and saying, hey, now I need to kind of up our game, right? We need to take it to the next level. Let's not incur all that tech debt, things like that. Or are you seeing the opposite more so where they're like, hey, how do we get started? And you guys kind of swing in and say, here you go.
So that we usually weave that into these discussions. So at the end of the day, how people started down this journey was there was statements that we needed to turn every network engineer into a software developer. And I think that has been a statement that's probably been more aggressive than it needed to be. I think there's nothing but benefit from understanding the technologies, understanding techniques, understanding how to apply them. But the reality is when we work with prospects and customers, they think about, if you say, hey, who's the best network engineer and also your best software developer, it tends to shrink the pool quite dramatically. And the drawback to that is we see in those organizations where they have those highly skilled individuals that feel comfortable in both domains. Then we create this queue system where we start giving people user stories and they start going through it. And we almost go back to an IT mindset, and people say agile, but it becomes waterfall because the pool of people that can participate is so small. So our real attitude around this is, and you'll see this within the CLI automation demo, is that we want people to use whatever automation technique they are comfortable with. We want to have the most people participate in automation. We don't want to have just the people that somehow have all 4 of the skill sets that somebody has. They got to write pipelines, and they got to be able to do network engineering, and they got to do these things. So from the platform perspective, we really want to encourage to have the most people participate in automation. So when you're seeing the automation studio, you'll see a very low code drag and drop interface, which we think everybody should feel comfortable with. But if somebody's writing a very complex Terraform plan, because that's the right tool to do their job, we want to encourage that. So I think in the first wave of automation kind of ecosystem you saw develop, it was really I'm going to build this generic orchestration platform and this generic controller. You're going to put everything in my magic software, and then everything will be great. And I think the reality is, if you look at how the network has evolved, you have a lot of diverse sets of networks, and the right tool might be different for different domains. So if we can somehow enlarge the number of people that can participate and tie it together and encourage kind of an all of the above automation strategy, that's really where we think is the most meaningful way to transform the business and support what we're talking about.
Awesome. Thank you.
So Chris, does that mean that your software supplements things like Terraform and Ansible, or are you looking to knock it over and be the tool?
Yeah, so it's I think maybe the demo will be most pertinent, but there's no requirement for any of those tools. But I think having a vertically integrated strategy towards network management, we've called that an EMS for a very long time, right? And then what you're seeing from people come present to NFD is they're calling it a controller now. And sometimes it's just an EMS that we renamed a controller, right? So from our perspective, what we care about is we care about talking to things that are quote unquote programmable. So that means that we can control it through software. So we have the gateway product, which converts basically, it makes those CLI concepts programmable. And then we have natively programmable things. So if I'm talking to an SD-WAN platform, they give me an open API spec. They describe their API through JSON schema. I just talk directly to that. So if you think of as the networking matures and as the management interface, which has come so far just in the last 7 years we've been doing this, it really makes it natively programmable. So it's less about knocking something over. It's more about let's take what you got, let's leverage it. If that's your tool of choice, keep crushing it with your tool of choice. We'll build an API on top of it. We'll use the most robust integration with your tool of choice, Terraform, Ansible, as you said, and then we'll go native to those things, and then we'll go native to IT systems, so you can build kind of an end-to-end automation concept, and that really kind of brings everybody up, right? I couldn't imagine going into some of these groups and saying like, stop using that tool, use this other tool. I mean, open revolt. So let's use the right tool for the right job and bring it together. That's really what you're going to hear from us.